You know, when I was growing up, I played a lot of sports in the yard with my brothers. A lot of wiffle ball and kickball and football. We always played until somebody got hurt or somebody quit. I also played Chinese checkers with my grandma growing up. I played checkers with my grandpa. And I played chess with my dad growing up. And I don't know about your family, but in my family, my dad and my grandpa, they never let us kids win any games. And so that's how I play chess and checkers with my boys. I do not let them win. And I always tell them, you learn more by losing than by winning. I just want to be a good teacher for my kids. So you're welcome, boys. When I taught my boys to play chess, I had to teach them about how the game is played. That the game of chess is played that you got to capture the king in order to win. And each of the different pieces, they have their different moves. The pawns, they can go 1 or 2 spaces at a time. You have the rook and the bishop. They can slide along either vertically or horizontally on the chessboard. But the queen is the most powerful piece on the game and the chessboard. She has to be protected and guarded as much as the king. You always have to keep an eye on the queen because she is very, very important. We've been talking about the story of Esther from the Bible recently, and we are about to see the undoing of the evil Haman because he overlooked the queen. He took his eyes off the queen. He underestimated her. He failed to consider her importance, and that becomes his downfall. In case you're unfamiliar with the book of Esther, maybe you haven't been here in a while, let me give you a quick recap of the story of Esther. Because we're in like number 4 of 5-week sermon series in here. It's a really unique book of the Bible. For one, it's a book of the Bible that doesn't mention God in any way. There's no prayers to God. There's no mention of God's laws. There's no prophecy. There's no talk about the temple. There's no talk about anything about God in the book of Esther. Well, we started in chapters 1 and 2, and we saw how Esther, a young orphan Jewish girl, was chosen by the king, Ahasuerus, to be the queen of Persia. And episode 2 was about Haman. Haman was the number 2 in the kingdom, just under the king, kind of like the prime minister, if you will. And he hated the Jewish people, primarily because of this guy named Mordecai. But he hated all of the Jewish people, and he issued an edict that said on a certain day all of the Jews would be killed and all of their property taken. But Esther was convinced by her adopted father, her cousin Mordecai, that she needed to go to the king on behalf of all of her Jewish people because they were all going to be killed, including her. Well, last week, Haman's evil rage reached its pinnacle whenever he said, I can't wait 11 months to kill all the Jews, including Mordecai. I'm just going to build a gallows 75 feet tall and have Mordecai hung on the gallows. But in a providential twist of fate, Haman was forced to honor Mordecai because the king, in a sleepless night, realized that he forgot to honor Mordecai for something good that Mordecai had done 5 years earlier. And this is where we're at in the story. Every week, it seems like there's been this cliffhanger that's taken place, one cliffhanger after another. And that's how the book of Esther is. It almost reads like a movie, like a story, like a novel. Well, we see in the book of Esther, like I said, the word God is not mentioned, but it's clear that God's invisible hand is at work to accomplish his purposes to protect his people. And so the big idea of today's message is that God turns the tables on evil. He defeats his enemies and gives victory to those who are his. God turns the tables on evil and gives victory to those who are his. So like I said, where we pick up in our story today is that Haman had just finished building a 75-foot gallows upon which to hang the person that he hated most, Mordecai the Jew. And Mordecai's death was meant to be kind of a foreshadow of what was going to take place 11 months in the future when all of the Jewish people were going to be wiped out. Well, Haman had already mapped out his next moves with deadly precision. Basically, he's thinking, I've got Mordecai in check, and now he's only a few hours away from declaring checkmate. But then something unexpected happened. all of a sudden, in a providential twist of fate, the tables were turned. You see, Haman was so consumed with his self-importance and so annoyed that Mordecai wouldn't bow down to him and show him honor that Haman had taken his eyes off of the queen. And you can't ever take your eyes off the queen. So if you open your Bibles to Esther chapter 7, I believe it's on page 456. We're going to be in Esther chapter 7 and 8 today. It's where we left off last week. In Esther chapter 7, our scene opens with another banquet. And if you're keeping score at home, this is the fifth banquet that we see in the book of Esther. The Persian people, especially the Persian kings, love their feasts. They loved a good banquet. I mean, we had earlier on in the book, we had two banquets that were given by the king, one by Queen Vashti, and then in our story now, Queen Esther had just given a banquet the night before. And this is where chapter 7 takes place. So what Esther had done is she was going to go to the king and ask for help, ask for relief from this edict that Haman had written that said that the Jewish people were going to get killed. So what she did was she prepared this meal, and she served this banquet just for the king and for Haman. And she called them all together, and she was going to say something, but she never did say anything to the king the night before. We don't know why she didn't say anything to the king, but she didn't. She didn't bring it up. And that's what led to the sleepless night of the king Ahasuerus, and that's what led to the king finding out what Mordecai had done, and that's where the tables had begun to turn against Haman. And notice what Esther now, this is the second day. This is the second day in a row that she has a big feast, a big banquet, and she invites the king and Haman to come to this banquet. And notice the tact and the courage that she shows here, because, like I said, for some reason, she didn't say anything the day before. But now she's getting ready. She's stealing her own resolve, you know. She's like, I'm going to say something. Today's the day. She can't delay it any longer. She knows, and the king knows, that she's called him together for this feast for some reason. And so she has to approach this here. And so he asked her in verse 2, for the third time, by the way, he says, Queen Esther, what is your wish? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to half of my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled. I mean, King Ahasuerus, he's thinking, come on, lady, out with it, you know? What do you want? I'm dying to know. What do you want to tell me? What do you want to ask me? I'm going to be generous to you. And he says, kind of hyperbole, up to half of my kingdom, in a way of saying, what do you want? Just tell me. He hadn't forgotten why she had called these feasts, why she had called these banquets together. And so now Esther, I just imagine she's probably, her knees are shaking, her palms are sweaty, she's getting ready to like say what she's got to say. She wants to come out with it. She builds up the courage, and then finally in verse 3 she says it. She finally says it. She says, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with a loss to the king. Notice how gentle she offers her request here, and how she phrases it in a way of saying, you know what, if we were only sold as slaves, which is pretty serious, you know, it already happened once in the history of her people, but she said, if we were just merely sold as slaves, I wouldn't have troubled the king. I wouldn't have bothered the king with this request. But it's a lot more serious than that. And she quotes the edict that Haman had written, word for word. Did you notice that? She said, to be destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated. And she's saying, this is what's going to happen. It's like, she just is like, finally, I got to say it, you know? After 5 years of being silent, where the king didn't even know that she was Jewish. She hadn't revealed it to the king for 5 years. And finally, she basically says, you know what? I'm tired of hiding my true identity. I'm tired of being Persian on the outside and Jewish on the inside. And finally, she says, if I perish, I perish. But I got to tell you about this, the king. And she drops this news, and it's like the ultimate mic drop. It's like she's just out with it, you know? And the king is stunned by the news. He hears this, and think about this. He shouldn't have been stunned by the news, really, right? I mean, yes, Haman wrote the edict, but the king stamped it with his own approval. You know, it had the king's seal on this. The thing is that the king, he probably never read the edict. He just gave his ring to Haman and said, do whatever you want to do, put my stamp on it, whatever. Oh, well, we're going to get extra money if you wipe out this people group that's insignificant and not worth anything? Okay, fine, I'll take more money. Do whatever you want to do. I mean, it wasn't very responsible of King Ahasuerus at all. I mean, it wasn't until later that Esther finally told the king the whole story, including the fact that she was really cousins with Mordecai. But for now, she doesn't really say it now. Now she just wants her husband to know that someone out there is planning to kill her and her extended family. It's amazing to me. Like, her timing is perfect. She was so cunning, right? You got to admire her in this situation. Well, when she dropped this bomb on the king, and Haman is sitting there, I'm sure Haman's eyes probably just got huge, right? He was like, oh no, the queen is Jewish? What was I thinking? I made a plan to kill the queen? And when Ahasuerus heard this, he's thinking that, what? Someone's after my family? Someone's trying to undermine my throne? Who could this be? And so he asked her, who is it? Where is he? Who has dared to do this? And that's when Esther in verse 6 says, a foe, an enemy, that wicked Haman. And Haman freezes. All the blood drains from his face. He becomes deathly pale because now he is terrified. The walls are crushing down around him. And the king is shocked. He's enraged. It says he gets up from the table, he leaves the table, and he goes into his palace garden, it says in verse 7, to think about this. Because he's got a lot to think about. He's got all kinds of things running around through his head, and he just needs some fresh air. He needs to clear his mind. He needs to be thinking. And there's a lot he's got to be thinking about. Number one is how in the world did I trust Haman like this? You know? How could I punish Haman for an edict that I have stamped with my own approval? How could I deal with Haman without admitting my own role in this situation? I mean, if I wanted to, how could I rescind a decree that is now a law? The law of the Medes and the Persians could not be changed. How could I possibly soften this law that is now going to wipe out all of the Jewish people? How could I somehow protect my queen's life and at the same time protect my reputation in this matter? And if I can't stop it, how can I explain the death of my queen that I helped cause, that I allowed to happen because I put Haman in this position? Why did I trust Haman? I think that's where his ire was really directed, because he's not going to blame himself, of course, you know. None of us is going to be thinking, well, I did something wrong, you know. He probably is thinking, I can't stand Haman in this situation. So he goes out to his garden, he walks around to get some fresh air. Now, keep this in mind. He leaves the scene, right? Esther is left at the table, along with Haman and probably 7 other servants that are standing in the room there. Now, when the king left the room, Haman is left alone with Esther. He could have run away. But if you're Haman and you run away, you're going to look really guilty, right? And where are you going to go to? They're going to find you. He could have followed the king into the garden, but he knows the king can't stand him right now. And he knows the king is going to be like, get out of my face, Haman. Get out of here. You know, he can't follow the king. So he stays where he's at in the room because he wants to beg the queen for his life, which is ironic, right? Haman was begging for his life from someone that he has committed to death. But really, even if she wanted to, she couldn't save him. She couldn't save herself. I mean, Haman had written an edict that said that she was going to be killed in 11 months. So basically, they both have their hands tied in one sense. They're both begging for their lives. And what's the king going to do? The law of the Medes and the Persians says that once an edict has been declared official with a royal stamp, it's not going to be changed. So we don't really know what's on King Ahasuerus' mind when he comes back into the room. But he comes back into the room, and lo and behold, what does he see? He is shocked at what he sees. Haman had fallen on his knees at her couch to beg for his life, maybe grabbing her leg or grabbing her arm, but he was reaching out to her, laying on the couch where she was reclining for dinner he was begging for his life. And this is so serious. You don't understand the seriousness of this because according to Persian custom, no person was allowed within 7 steps of the queen. You weren't allowed within 7 steps of the queen. And if any person was to lay a hand on the queen, that was a capital offense. You could be put to death for that. So he walks in and he sees Haman falling on the couch of his queen, and he gets upset. He blows a lid and says, will he even assault or will he even violate or molest the queen in my presence, in my own house? I mean, Haman probably wasn't doing that. It wasn't like he was trying to molest or violate the queen right there. But you know what it did do? It was allowed the king off the hook with that question of what's he going to do with Haman, because we all know what's going to happen to Haman now. Even the servants know this is a capital offense, and they cover his head in shame and disgrace, knowing that basically Haman has sealed his own death warrant. He went out on a limb, and that limb has fallen and crashed. But there's one more twist, though. You know, like I said earlier, Haman was an evil dude, and Haman probably was not well liked in the kingdom. And I say this because the eunuchs, the king's eunuchs, the servants, they were standing around, and one of them speaks up. He didn't have to speak up, but one of them speaks up and tells the king, oh, you know what? Haman had prepared a gallows for Mordecai. You remember Mordecai? Mordecai. Yesterday, Mordecai, you remember 2 nights ago when you couldn't sleep? And yesterday how you gave Mordecai your robes and put him on the royal horse and rode him around the city center saying how you love to honor Mordecai? Haman had prepared a gallows to kill Mordecai, and it's right outside the door. What a coincidence. And so now the king says, oh yeah, you know, this is a political issue now, right? Because you're trying to undermine my throne. This is an act of disloyalty. And so in the ultimate act of poetic justice, Haman gets hung on the same gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Once again, we see that even though God is not mentioned in this text, God is in control. Even when God is silent, he is present. Even when God seems removed, he is sovereign. And even when God seems to be running late, his purposes are always on time. You know, it should give us great comfort to know that God is sovereign and that God is just. When it seems like all hope is lost, we can be assured that evil does not have the final say, and that God sets everything right in his time. But there's also a warning for us here in the story of Haman as well, and that is that oftentimes we are victims of our own making. Too many times we are quick to blame others for our sin instead of taking responsibility for our sin. Yes, there are people and there are situations that give us the opportunity to sin, but ultimately we are the ones who decide to act on our own sinful tendencies. To me, Haman is kind of like that cartoon character, Wile E. Coyote. Remember that from Saturday morning cartoons? He was always chasing the coyote. He was always chasing the roadrunner. And like the roadrunner, Mordecai never did anything to Haman except not bow down to him. Mordecai never did anything to hurt Haman. He just said, beep, beep, and kept on going. And like Wile E. Coyote, Haman's demise came about through his own evil plans. It's like how Wile E. Coyote would, set a bomb, roadrunner would run past it, and then Wile E. Coyote would come up and get blown up by the bomb, right? Haman created the gallows for Mordecai. Mordecai went beep, beep, went on by, and then it blew up in Haman's face. And really, just like the cartoon, think about this. If Haman would have just stopped, if he would have just stopped, then he would never have been put to death on the gallows that he made for Mordecai. You know, God is just, and evil doesn't have the final word. And oftentimes, God uses reversals in our lives to move us forward and make us wiser. Because think about this, if had this edict never been written and sent throughout the empire, then Esther would have never revealed her secret. She and Mordecai might have just continued to live their lives in comfort where they were. They would never have had to reveal their true identity. It was only the threat of impending death and hopelessness that decree brought about that caused their own personal revival. It was the fear and hopelessness that brought them back to faith again. And it was that reversal of fortune that returned them to the roots of who they really were. God continues to use reversals to bring us back into trust and dependence on him sometimes. So oftentimes God puts us through difficulties and through trials and then brings us through them to show to us that we can trust him. Even when we can't see him and even though we can't feel him, we need to be reminded that he is there and that he cares for us. You know, our story could end there, but the story isn't over because Haman's edict, even though Haman is dead, his edict still is alive. The process is still set into motion there. It's signed with the king's seal. It's still in effect. And things are looking better for Mordecai and Esther. According to Persian law, if someone was put to death for treason, their property was transferred over to the crown. And so the king could do whatever he wanted with Haman's property, and he gives it all to his wife. And then he takes Haman's place and gives that to Mordecai. So basically, Mordecai gets elevated. He gets a promotion. He takes Haman's place in the kingdom. But then Esther knows that the story isn't over, so she continues to beg the king and plead for help. And she makes a plea to his emotions in Esther chapter 8, verse 5. She says, "If it pleases the king, if I have found favor in his sight." And then she makes a moral plea saying, if this thing seems right to the king, she's asking him, please, can you revoke Haman's death warrant? And he basically says, there's nothing I can do. The law is the law. And we know from history that Persian kings prided themselves on their infallibility. And to them, they thought, why would I ever need to repeal a law? Whatever they signed was right. And so if he was to try to revoke the law, he would be admitting that he had made a mistake. And he wasn't in the business of admitting making mistakes. But here's what he does do. He takes off his ring that he had gotten from Haman, and he gives it to Mordecai and tells him to make a new decree, whatever he wants. And so Mordecai creates a new edict, basically saying that the Jewish people can now defend themselves on this day of destruction. And using the same words that Haman used, they can now prepare themselves to take vengeance on their enemies, it says in verse 13. And the word vengeance there, it means to right a previous wrong. The new official decree, it goes out in the same way that the first went out on the Persian version of the Pony Express. And they send it out in the same way throughout the whole empire, from the capital of Susa all the way to Sudan in Africa, from as far north as Central Asia and modern-day Uzbekistan to as far south as Yemen. 2.1 million square miles covering 50 million people get the message that the Jewish people were going to defend themselves if anyone were to attack them on that day. You see, the old law could not be changed, but a new law is in effect. And it also comes with the authority of the king himself. You know, I can't help but see glimpses of the gospel here in the story of Esther. Although Ahasuerus was a dumb ruler who couldn't make decisions on his own, apparently, opposite of that, we serve a wise God who always makes good decisions, who is king over all. God's law cannot be changed. God's word is God's law. And going against God's law is breaking God's command. It's called sin. R.C. Sproul calls sin cosmic treason. Cosmic treason. We have rebelled against the God who created us. Some people think that God's laws are not that important, that we can just ignore them. And they think that God will never hold them accountable for their sins because, hey, isn't that just the way we are? But the truth is that a just God, a righteous judge, can never overlook sin. To ignore law breaking would be injustice. But that's where the good news of the gospel comes in, because God sent his son, Jesus, to take the place for our sin, to take our place. Justice is satisfied because of Jesus' death on the cross in the place of sinners. Think about this. Haman died on a device that he made for Mordecai. You know, in our English Bibles, that word is translated as gallows. But that word gallows in Hebrew can also be translated. In fact, it's more often translated as the word tree. Galatians 3:13 says, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree. Unlike Haman, Christ willingly died. He became a curse for us so that we could receive his blessing. Satan thought he had won the day when Jesus died on the cross, but the symbol of shame and defeat became the picture of victory when Christ rose from the grave. And then look at what happened to Mordecai. He's given the signet ring, symbolizing authority over the entire empire of the world. He becomes the righteous man who is finally vindicated and given all authority. Mordecai is transfigured. Look at verse 15. It says, Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white. That's the colors of the Persian Empire, with a great golden crown upon his head. And everyone in the city celebrates with joyous celebration. In verse 16 it says, the Jews had light or hope. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews, for fear of the Jews had fallen on them. Some people say a great revival took place, and many people converted to Judaism to worship the one true living God. Other people say, nah, they were just acting Jewish because it was the cool thing to do at the moment. We don't really know, honestly. Again, there's so many times in the book of Esther where we are left to wonder what people are actually thinking because we don't really have all the information. The author just says this is what happened. So we don't really know. Actually, I don't ever really know, honestly, at the end of the day, if someone is a true believer in Jesus when I first meet them, even if they tell me they are. I can't tell if someone is a true believer or if they're just pretending. I've heard a lot of stories of people who spent their whole lives in church, but who never were really born again until something happened or the Holy Spirit spoke to their heart one day and they realized that they weren't a Christian and then they gave their lives to Christ. That's what we call a false convert, somebody who is either intentionally or unintentionally pretending to be a Christian, but who's not really born again. And honestly, I think there could be a lot of false converts in a church, and I don't know. Thankfully, it's not my job to decide. God is the judge. In the end, he's the one who's going to judge, not me. But I do know this, that if anyone comes to Christ for anything other than Christ, then you've missed the boat. If you come to Christ because you think he's going to heal you or make your life more comfortable, then comfort is what you're after. It's not Jesus. If you come to Christ because you think he's going to make you rich, then money is your God. It's not Jesus. If you come to Christ because you think it'll improve your social standing, then that means you desire the approval of man over the approval of God. The only reason why we come to Christ is because he is the only one who can save us. You know, I want to end with this, that God, he gives us so much more than we could ever ask or imagine. Look at how things turned out for Mordecai. He is clothed in royalty and received with shouts of joy. And it's like this. Did you notice this? You compare his day from the day before to his day now. His second reward is greater than his first. Someday, we will be transfigured. For those who are in Christ, this mortal tent, as Paul calls our bodies that are wasting away, they will be cast aside in place of a new, glorious, sin-free body. And we will receive rewards when we come into God's kingdom. There will be a wonderful celebration at the Lord's table with light and gladness and joy and honor. And so we need to be thankful for what we have today while we look forward to the day of Christ's return. Charles Spurgeon, the London Baptist preacher, once told a story of this. He said, I heard one time of a good old woman in a cottage who had nothing but a piece of bread and a little water. And lifting up her hands in a blessing, she said, what? All this and Christ too? Matthew Henry, the 17th century commentator, used to say that all the time when he would consider the small blessings that God gives us in life. He would say, all this and heaven too. God is so good to us. He blesses us abundantly, and then he promises an eternity with him with joy that we can't even ask or imagine about. So live with confidence today because the ultimate enemy has been defeated. And when facing opposition, know that we don't fight from victory, but we don't fight for victory, we fight from a place of victory because Christ has won the victory for us. He has turned the tables on evil. He has defeated the enemy, and God gives the victory to those who are his.